Bonjour everyone, in today's video I'll be showing you how I cut and hand sew a stretchy top. I used three different stretch stitches for this and I used four measurements for this top. So the measurements I used were my upper bust measurement minus 1 inch ease, my off shoulder measurement minus 1 inch ease. For the off shoulder measurement, that's what I call it for this video at least, but it's just one off shoulder. I did move my tape around just to feel it around my back that it is not hanging loose, it is taut. Next, I took my waist measurement, removed 1 inch ease as well. Lastly, I used my upper bust to waist measurement. With the main purpose of this video being to show you how to hand sew stretchy fabric, I had to use the stretchiest fabric I had on hand. It just so happened to be a velvet fabric that has a two-way stretch. And because it's velvet, it has a nap. I do have to make sure that it is going to the same direction, front and back. So that's why I'm checking for here. And what I did was fold my fabric in half. It's not a lot of fabric that I had. I did have to improvise, but I just used what I had. This project is free-handed. I did not make a pattern for this. That's why I use my measurements. So here I have my fabric folded in half. I am going to measure my upper bust to waist measurement plus my hem that I determined. So I measured up to 12.5 inches and I marked there. What I'm marking is my upper bust point. So here I am using my ruler to square across from that point. And on that line, I am going to mark a quarter of my upper bust measurement. That's after I remove the 1 inch ease of the circumference. I am marking a quarter here. So next, I am doing the same thing for the waist as well, a quarter of the waist. That's what I'm marking on here. And you can tell that the hem of my fabric is not even, so I'm just drawing a line to even it out and making sure everything is straight. So I'm going to draw a line straight from my waist because it's just my upper bust to waist measurement, not to my hip. So I connect my upper bust point to my waist now, and I am just gonna smooth out the line here. Next, I'm just trimming excess that is uneven here at my hem. So I'm just removing that. And it may remove some of my hem, but it's not that much. It's just trimming off uneven parts. Next, I'm just going to start cutting. And you may notice that my seam allowance is more than I would usually leave it out. But there's a reason for that. It's because I'm using a different stitch for my side seams. And so next, I'm opening it so that I can create the asymmetrical part. So once I have my fabric laid flat here, I am also going to mark the upper bust point on the other side where the chalk mark is not, right here. Next, I'm going to build the asymmetrical part. So I go in 2.5 inches from the side seam here. And from that point, I go up 2.5 inches. And then I just connect that point to the main line, just like so. So I'm going to draw a curve. To do that, I go 1 inch from the angle, like I just did, and I'm going to just create a curve touching that point. That's my underarm now that I just built. So to connect my point to the side seam on the other end, I made sure I marked my seam allowance and then just connected the points. And just like that, my piece is done. That just so happens to be my back piece that I just created. And I'm going to draw the front piece from that. I'm going to cut the front piece from that same piece that I have here. And of course, because this is velvet, I have to make sure the nap is going the same direction for the front and for the back. That's what I'm checking here. And I just laid my piece flat and placed that completed piece on top of it, right sides together. And I pinned the edges around because it kept curling up, so that helped with the issue. And then I just cut. And this is all I need for my front and back. I feel this is an easy top. I do think if you have a larger bust, you might want to take that into consideration to shape the garment around your bust to your waist more. And so now that I have my front and back cut out, I am using the little piece that I have here to create my flap for the off shoulder section. That's what I'm doing here. And it took a lot of time for me to actually determine what to do here because initially I was going to use the piece to create two, one for the front and for the back, but I realized that this is just too little. I'm not going to have enough to have a hem and then also seam allowance to sew it in. So I decided to just make that one piece and just use a different fabric for my back. It just is what I had to do because I just wanted to use the stretchiest fabric that I had and this just was it. So therefore I just had to make it work that way. So here I am just tracing a line to mark my off-shoulder measurement. and I'm marking half of that instead of a quarter measurement. I'm marking half of the measurement of my off shoulder measurement that I took from the beginning, removed 1 inch ease, and then half of that I'm putting on the line here. And I did mark it on the diagonal instead of a straight line. That is just a wiser thing to do, I believe, in my opinion. If you do make it straight, it might affect the hang of your fabric. So I think you have to cut it on a diagonal to get the right effect. So although it doesn't seem like it, but it took some time for me to actually make up my mind and decide what I was gonna do, and then came up with the idea to just use a different fabric and just leave this as a one piece and for the front, and then use a different fabric for the back. So that's what I ended up going with. So this is the piece that I finished, and I'm just using it for the front, and I'm gonna use it to cut the back piece from it. So if I had enough fabric, this is what I would have done from the get-go for the front. I would have folded my fabric and cut my piece from there on a fold. I would not have done an individual piece. It would have been a folded piece. But because I was just using the fabric that I had, I just decided it's just gonna be a single layer. And so I'm using that to cut the back piece out now, and I'm keeping the back piece on a fold. I'm cutting it on a fold horizontally. And I'm just spinning it to keep it in place because my fabric is slippery underneath. So I want to make sure I cut the piece to the same exact measure. So if you are following along, then I would hope you understand that you would then start with your fabric folded from when I started creating the front off shoulder piece. I do wonder if I did it folded for the front and for the back, if my fabric would twist along the way, because when you fold it like this and cut it on the diagonal, you have one side of the layer, one layer going on the one direction, the other layer going a different direction, which I would assume would lead to some twisting of the garment eventually. So I do wonder. I may have to test this eventually to see if it will work. One thing I forgot to do is add notches on my off shoulder piece, so that would come from the regular side seam to the underarm point, but I forgot to do that and forgot to show it. So next I created bias tape because that's how I'm going to finish my underarm and also the section of my off shoulder part that's gonna fit my arm through. So I have my bias tapes for these pieces to finish them. And then I just pin my side seams and ready to sew. Therefore, I'm going to prepare my pieces to sew now. And what I'm doing is using my straight stretch stitch, which is really a hemline stitch, but I did have a comment that inspired me to actually use it for this reason because the person had asked a question and she mentioned couture sweater. Initially, I told her you can't use this for sewing seams, it's for hemlines. But then when she mentioned couture, I thought if it is couture, it has to be polished on the inside. Therefore, I thought this is the easiest way to do it for a stretchy fabric to make sure it looks polished on the inside. Therefore, here's the way to prepare it. I am folding the fabric over twice after trimming one of the layer of the fabric off. So this is why my seam allowance is much more than it would normally be because I'm doing the fold over twice. And I could have trimmed the upper piece more, the top piece more, but that it's fine. I just the reason I'm doing this, I'm even trimming it is because I want to avoid bulk. And if I had left it as is, it would add to my width of the fabric, making it more loose, and I don't want that. I actually wanted my top to be more fitted, so I really think that I could have gone with -2 inch ease. But that it works fine. Anyway, I'm not mad at how it turned out, but this is how I'm preparing my fabric to sew it with that hemline stitch. So therefore, that stitch can be used for sewing side seams and still maintain your stretch. This is the main stitch that I use for my garments, just so I can show you that it does stretch. Even though for my side seams, you're not gonna see a stretch because I only have a two-way stretch on my fabric. But for the other sections, I will be showing you how much it stretches. But anyways, my fabric is now prepared and ready to sew. So I'm doing the same thing for the off shoulder piece as well. I am trimming the back part because that is a double layered part. Therefore, that is the part that I'm going to actually fold my fabric onto. If I had enough fabric to where I would have had enough to create my front and back piece of the off shoulder on a fold, I would not have pinned my fabric this way. I would have opened the fold, sewed the side seams together, and then fold it back up. But because I had to improvise, that's why I'm doing it this way, folding the top piece here over the back piece, because the back piece has two layers. Since it's on the fold, it's just less bulky that way. Now I have my pieces all ready to be sewn using that stretch stitch that I would normally use for the hemline. So this is my side seam on the bodice that I'm going to demonstrate that for you on. And I go through the fold here and go back to where the stitch started underneath it through the layers. Go through the fold and then back to where the stitch started underneath through the layers. And we go through the layers because these are, we're sewing seams here, not a hemline. We have one single layer of fabric, but this is a seam, we're sewing two pieces of fabric together. So you go through the fold and go underneath it through the layers from where the stitch started. And that's how it continues on. And if you do feel like this is not strong enough for you, you can do a zigzag stitch, half back stitch, zigzag stitch, because that is very fast to sew. You can see the back is not as neat as I would have wanted to be. It's supposed to be straight stitches, but it doesn't look that clean. But I think the stitch itself is strong enough. I did wash and dry the garment. I'll show you at the end. It looks untouched to me. But of course, over time, garments wear out. But I do think this stitch is strong enough. But if you don't feel like it is for you, you can do a zigzag stitch before you do this step. That is if you care that your garment looks neat on the inside. The reason why I do this is just so that I can have a neat looking garment on the inside. And I think it's great that I can do that by hand sewing without a serger and on a stretchy garment. I think that's pretty cool. So yeah. So this is what it's looking like after I'm done sewing it. This is the back from where we were sewing. And it's not looking straight in my opinion, but overall I think the inside of the garment still looks neat, even though my stitches are not straight. This is the other side I did with matching thread, and that's how that turned out. It's still not neat. The stitches are still not that straight, but inside the garment to me looks nice for a stretchy garment. So next step is to connect the bicep to the underarm. So I pin it to the underarm and then I use zigzag stitch. And I use the double back stitch method for the zigzag stitch to do it. And I will demonstrate that for the other bicep piece that I will be adding to the garment. But this is how that turned out. That's my outside. That's my inside actually, the right side. That's what it's looking like. You can still see the seams. That's why I don't like using zigzag stitches because I feel like the stitches are too visible. Even if it's done on a sewing machine, I feel like when you use zigzag stitches, it's still visible because of how the stitch is sewn. It's just different. But anyways, I trim the excess before I folded the bicep back in to just sew it back again. And this is not going to have a lot of stretch because most of it is on the vertical line of the fabric. So my underarm, it doesn't have that much stretch for me to demonstrate to you how stretchy this turned out, with it being sewn over twice at that. But you'll get to see that on the next bicep that I add. So to finish this, I use the same stitch that I've been using, the stretch stitch. Once I have it pinned, I just went over it and sewed with that stitch. And in my opinion, it looks neat. You cannot see the stitches on the velvet side, but you can see the groove of the mark it leaves. But it still looks neat in my opinion for a stretchy fabric, being that it's velvet as well. This is my first time hand sewing velvet fabric. It was very challenging. I thought about changing my mind many times. But anyways, before I add the off shoulder to the bodice, I prepare the edges of my fabric so I can keep them from overstretching. So I use the running stitch to create a basting stitch around the edges. That's how I keep my fabric in place so that I don't overstretch it as I sew it. Everything just stays in place. I think that's amazing. The things we can do with hand sewing, to me, it's amazing. So I do the same thing for the off shoulder piece too. You can see how I'm stretching it. It's not stretching because I have the basting stitch going. because it's a basting stitch, that means we have a starting stitch and an ending stitch that anchors the stitches in place. So yeah, here because I forgot to create my notches, I am just showing you here how I am marking the notches. So we know from where to start sewing and where to stop on the off shoulder piece. So that's what I'm doing here, marking where well, I was supposed to have my notches. I'm just using pins to do so. For the space that's left, that's not going to be sewn to the bodice, I am going to use my bodice tape to finish that side, that piece that's not going to be sewn to the bodice. And that fabric rips so easily, so it was very important for me to do the running stitches in order to keep the ripping effect from happening on my actual garment. So yeah. Here I am just laying my pieces together the way I will be attaching them. And it took some time for me to determine how that would happen. This is a garment I've not done before, and I would love to do it again actually, but the right way with the right amount of fabric, honestly. But and definitely not with velvet because velvet is I never knew how frustrating it would be to handsew velvet. I learned something for sure. But anyways, this is me figuring out how I'm going to sew the pieces together. So I ended up doing the fold over from the bodice onto the off shoulder part. It was the wiser thing to do because the back I have the folded layers, so that helped with the bulk. And I ended up not trimming any excess to fold over my piece because I just figured my garment is short anyway, so what's the harm in having the extra length, which is probably maybe 1/8 to a quarter of an inch. And so even with the off shoulder piece, even if I have extra length, so what? But that's the part that I end up having extra length on, so that's fine with me, not the bodice. When you're in the midst of it, it's hard to figure out which part is gonna have the extra length because it was just so much. It felt like so much. Yeah. But this is after I pin it all around from one part of the armhole to the other. And here I am doing my stretch stitch again, my straight stretch stitch, and the same exact way that I showed you for the side seam. That's what I'm doing here. And this was very hard to do because I'm sewing on the velvet. That's what made it very challenging. If you don't know now, hand sewing velvet is very challenging. It is I guess it depends on the stitches as well. Perhaps it's the stitches I use because it was so easy for me to sew the side seams because I was sewing on the wrong side of it, but actually sewing on the nap, it's just sewing on the right side. That's very challenging, and that's what I'm doing here. It was challenging to figure out whether this is it going inside the fold like I wanted to, or is it just touching the nap. So that's what made it hard. I guess that's the stitch I used and just how I was sewing it because I was actually sewing on the right side. So yeah. When it was all done, it did what it was supposed to do. It looked the way it was supposed to look. It wasn't overly stretchy. You can see how I was not able to stretch it because I still have the running stitch going. So I am now trying to remove the running stitch so I can get my fabric to stretch because as long as you have that running stitch there, it is not going to stretch. So it's just amazing the amount of stitches we have that we can use to do whatever we want to do when it comes to hand sewing, in my opinion. So now my fabric can stretch because my basting stitch is gone and I was loving it. And it snaps back, so it's kind of cool. I think that's amazing when you are sewing knit. Sometimes you may stretch something and it just stays stretched, and that's really bad. But in this case, everything snaps back, so I loved it. So after I added my off-shoulder piece to the bodice, I have now the exposed part that I have to finish, and I have my bi-stitch pin to it and pin to that seam allowance on the armhole section, on the arm section, and I'm ready to sew. So I decided to use the double back stitch method to create a zigzag stitch here. And I didn't have to do this, but I guess because I had it made up in my mind that was the stitch that I was going to use, so I ended up going for it. But you can use the half back stitch method to create a zigzag here that will work just as fine, especially because you go over this fabric again. You go over it again to finish off the bias binding. So I really do think that the half back stitch method is enough. And I do have a tutorial on how to hand sew zigzag stitches. So definitely check that out. I have three methods that I showed you, and I'm not a fan of zigzag stitches, but they work for having stretch. So I guess, it's useful. But I just don't like them because when you open the seam, even if it's hand sewing, you can still see more thread than you would if you were to do a back stitch. That's what I don't like about zigzag stitches. No matter how you do them, I feel like that's just almost inevitable. And I think maybe that's what I was thinking to do, for me to do the double back stitch method, but it is the same thing. You still have as much fabric visible, or as much thread visible when you open your seams, in my opinion at least. And this is what it's looking like after I'm done sewing my zigzag stitch. I do have stretch. I don't think I demonstrated it, but I do have to fold it over again to finish my binding, and then you'll see how that goes. I am trimming off the excess before I do fold it over. So after folding it over and pinning it, I am removing my basting stitch from the back side because I had already removed it from the front side. Now I'm removing it from the back side because I don't think I will have a chance. I didn't think I would have a chance to remove it once I sewed over the binding. You can stretch your fabric and break the basting stitch inside. However, the idea of just hearing a thread break, it just would make me wonder which thread is breaking. Although I know my stretch stitch would not break, but I still would not feel comfortable. I just think it just gives me peace of mind to remove it before, without having to stretch it to break it. But here, this is the amount of stretch I have. Not a lot. Once you sew over it twice, I feel like the stretch then becomes limited. You can see here, compared to the body, it's just different. The stretch is limited, in my opinion. So this is my piece where after attaching everything together, I did sew the hem using that same stretch stitch, the hem of the off-shoulder piece, that is. This is what I did here. You can see the amount of stretch I have, pretty good. Next, to finish off the garment, I am going to sew my hem. And so I'm doing the invisible stretch hem, and that is by using the half back stitch zigzag method. And I think that's a very easy stitch to do. I have a tutorial on it as well. I will link it to this video. But that is what I'm using to create the hemline for my top, the invisible hem stitch. And you could use the stretch stitch, that will work fine. But I just wanted to use something different. So I used the invisible stretch stitch. Yeah, invisible stretch hem stitch. So overall, I used three different stitches for this garment: the zigzag stitch, the stretch stitch, and then the invisible stretch stitch. Those are the three stitches that I used. So this is how I position my fabric to sew. I have positioned over my finger to sew the invisible hem stitch. So of course, I'm doing the stitch that I demonstrated in my main tutorial for this. It is the half back stitch, but you can use any other zigzag stitch to create this invisible hem stitch. It works just as well. But this is the fastest one and it's strong enough. It's good for its purpose. So I highly recommend using this. It's gonna save you time. It does its job. So yeah, it does its job because I'm using a lighter colored thread and you cannot see it on the right side. So that's just how you know it works. It is an invisible stitch, hem stitch, stretch stitch. So yeah. Only challenges to me in doing this was having to sew on the velvet part. That was a bit challenging for me, especially because I keep wondering, am I going through the actual fabric or just the pile of the fabric? But it ended up working out fine for me eventually. And I did not do the basting stitch for this because I felt confident enough that I was not going to stretch my fabric. So the basting stitch is optional. That's just to help you keep your fabric from overstretching, but you don't have to do it. But I do recommend you do it if you're cutting your piece on a diagonal line, then that helps a lot. I think it helps overall, so I recommend it, but it's not a must. It's optional. So this is my right side. That's what it's looking like. Barely, you can barely see the stitch. You can see the groove of it. I don't know how that is. I mean, it's strong enough, but you cannot see the stitch. So that works for me. It's great in my opinion. I overall like this project because everything worked for what it's supposed to. The stitches worked for what they're supposed to work for. These are garment making stitches, in my opinion, not embroidery stitches. And I wanted to show you how to use them on stretchy fabrics. So yeah, stay tuned for more. I do want to make a garment where I show you how to attach neckband. So stay tuned for that. My garment is done. It is completed. I do think I did the bare minimum with attaching the off shoulder. It could have been more flat, but I'll do this again. Initially, I wanted to do a tube top because the main goal was to just show you how to use the hand sewing stitches for stretchy fabric. But then I saw the picture on the right and I thought I could add something more to this tube top and make it more interesting. So the picture actually inspired the project. So that's what we have here. And honestly, I was satisfied with my project before the picture. I pulled up a picture, but now that I pulled up the picture, I'm looking at my project. I'm like, what is this? What have I done? After all, we live and we learn, and I have a lot to learn when it comes to designing. So it is what it is. I'm satisfied overall, even though I won't be wearing this outside. And honestly, even the back looks better than the front to me now that I'm looking at it. Anyway, this is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Comment below on what you thought I missed that you would have want to learn more of. And until next time, bye.